Vintage camera lenses. Not only are they here to stay, but they're making a strong comeback. And at a time when a 5-year-old digital camera is considered outdated and obsolete, some of these 50-plus-year-old lenses are more expensive and desirable now than the day they were made. If you're curious what I'm talking about and why these lenses are so special, stick around. We're going to be checking out one of the most iconic, mass-produced, and well-respected vintage lenses out there. We're going to be looking at the Helios 44-2. Now, before I do anything, this lens has an interesting history. Sometime after World War II, the Russians took control of the German Carl Zeiss factory. They took all the plans and decided to make their own line of lenses using the Zeiss optical formulas. This Helios is actually a copy of the Zeiss Biotar. Now, I'm staying out of the politics of that whole situation, but fortunately for us, this Helios is a very effective copy. So this lens is 58mm. It's a very slight telephoto on a full-frame camera, which is what I recommend using it on. But if you're using it on a micro four thirds like I am, the focal length is doubled to 116mm, making it very zoomed in and not too practical in a lot of situations. For that reason, I'm using a generic focal reducer I got on eBay for $90. It widens the field of view and increases the light by 1 stop. I'm so impressed with the quality of this focal reducer, I gave up trying to find faults with the optics. Don't ask me to compare it to the $400 metabones though, I don't have one. And realistically, the way global manufacturing is, I wouldn't be surprised to find out down the road that the two were made in the same factory. I don't like these screw mount lenses, I rather the bayonet type, but it is what it is. Thing to keep in mind is the focus ring is in the back, the aperture ring is in the front. The only solid part of the lens is right here, the depth of field gauge. So that's the part you're going to grab when you're loosening or tightening. And another reason I don't like it is if you don't tighten it enough, you might be focusing and not realizing that you're actually unscrewing the lens. So just make sure you keep it on tight and you shouldn't have any problems. I couldn't call this a proper review without talking about what makes this lens so famous. That is its Swirly Bouquet. It's the lens claim to fame. When you look at the center of the photo, the highlights are perfectly round. But the further from the center you go, the highlights become more and more oblong, creating a swirly illusion in the background. It is very unusual. It happens at the widest apertures when your subject and the background are a certain range from the camera. It's an imperfection in the lens that creates this beautiful effect. It's something you would never find in a modern lens and a perfect example of the character some of these older lenses have that make them so artistically valuable. Alright, I'm going to show you something now about this aperture that makes no sense. If you look here, notice I have it set to f16 or f11, whatever that is. But if you look in the lens, it's wide open. Now, if I close the aperture all the way, the dot is pointing at f2. So what that's telling us is that this ring has nothing to do with what aperture you're currently at. This is what they call a minimum aperture setting, and it's a ring that turns. I know I'm not perfectly in focus. So what happens is if I set it to f16, the smallest aperture I can turn it to is f16. It's fully functional. Let's say I turn it to f2. The aperture won't go any smaller than f2. So this is something from the film days when they used to have to open the aperture as wide as possible to get the brightest image in the viewfinder, and at the last minute they would close the aperture to what they want to take the photo at. So if you're using this on a digital camera today or mirrorless camera, this setting is pretty much irrelevant. What you'll need to do is just turn it all the way to f16. That way you can use the full aperture movement. The problem is then you really don't know what aperture you're at. If it's wide open, you know that's f2. If it's all the way closed, you know that's f16. But everything in between is a mystery. It's not a deal breaker, but there's times you're gonna want to include your aperture information in photos that you post. There you go, just a little freestyle intermission edit to give you a taste of the image quality. Now back to the lens review. The next thing this lens is well known for is the way it flares in sunlight. It can be very cinematic and artistic. But like any kind of art, you need to be able to control it rather than it controlling you, because it can be overpowering at times. So I'm going to give you a few basic tips how to modulate that flare to get the best image quality. Alright, check this out. Look inside the front lens element. You're going to see a shiny ring. If it was up to me, that ring would have been painted flat black, because when direct sunlight hits it, it scatters light and reflects it throughout the lens, and it winds up creating a harsh moon-shaped flare. Sometimes the shape changes depending on where you're pointing the lens. So if you want to tone it down a little, this is what you do. If you slightly close the aperture blades actually block a lot of that flare around the outside. It won't totally remove it, but it will definitely clean up the picture a lot, as you can see here. One of the accessories I recommend everyone who owns this lens get is a sunshade, and I don't recommend you get the petal shaped one like what I got, because sometimes light can enter through the corners. I recommend you get the solid tubular one. But as you can see here, there's times when you're shooting directly into light and the hood won't make any difference. So keep in mind, this is a flaring kind of lens. So how am I getting the flare to diminish now? You guessed it, I'm using my hand to block the light. It's not going to be practical in every situation, especially when you're shooting video. So keep in mind, if it's not a look you want, you're going to have to recompose your shot. The next accessory I highly recommend is getting an ND filter for this lens. Now, for example, my camera tops out at 4000 shutter speed, and most people want to shoot this lens at or near wide open for that special look. So an ND filter is very important. The more I use this lens, the more I realize it's actually an advanced lens, because to get the most of it, you're going to have to use skill and knowledge. Another thing I realized, a lot of filmmakers choose this particular lens to use over modern electronic ones because of the control it gives and the special artistic look they can get from it. When I started shooting this lens review over a month ago, I had no idea where it would lead, but my mission was to create the most thorough Helios review I possibly could. So hopefully this video is able to benefit many of you out there. Hopefully it's a treasure trove of information. I want to thank you for watching this episode of Ray's Real Reviews, and as always, until next time, keep it real.